Hello, everyone. Welcome to Prone to Wander, a conversation delving into the Christian life and how we are to live a life that glorifies God and enjoys Him forever. This podcast is something that is unique because it is a conversation between two people who are almost exactly 60 years apart. My name is Jonathan Claxton, and I've had the privilege of living a few blocks away from Reverend Douglas Petersen, who also happens to be my grandfather. We often talk about the Christian walk and wanted to give a window into these conversations for those who are interested. We're going to cover a variety of topics and are going to express our own opinions. These particular conversations arise from matters I have wanted to discuss with my grandfather, so I'm learning these things along with you as a listener. We hope you enjoy and pray God works through even these conversations to bring us all closer to Him. Well, Grandpa, thank you for joining me today. Today's going to be talking primarily about your story, and even though I know a fair amount of it, you've kind of let me know that there's a lot of it I don't know, and I'm excited to learn about that. So I guess let's start with where you are now, kind of the nuts and bolts of who Doug Petersen is, where you're currently located, and then we'll get into the story of how you got there.
Well, thank you, Jonathan. It's good to be able to talk with you today. Where I am now, of course, is still just a few blocks from where you were growing up. And I'm here because 12 years ago, almost exactly 12 years ago, I retired from a full-time pastorate and moved here to be near your family. Uh, and in the process, ended up being asked to become the stated supply pastor at Westminster Associate Reformed Presbyterian Church in Albemarle. Uh, I took the position assuming that it might last for a couple of years as a transition to a new pastor, but here I am 12 years later, still in the same position. And I don't know whether that says more about me or about the church or just the general circumstances, but there I am. And I'm happy to be here. I have enjoyed these years. They have flown by. We have a small congregation, but it's a lovely little congregation, wonderful, diverse group of people. And I feel a sense of freedom in my pastoral work now that I didn't really feel during the years of the full-time pastorate, maybe because there's less administrative work and those kinds of things, uh, but also it's been a time when I've come to see things in a way that I didn't see them before, and that's pretty general. But it's been a time of discovery for me, and it's been a time of where my peace and joy in the Lord has grown, and being in relationship with your family and with our church has been an important part of that. And that's given me some insights on my own life uh, in the years before you came along that are, I think, have been valuable to me and may be valuable for other people too, at least in terms of seeing how God has worked in my own life.
Absolutely. And we're very thankful that the Lord has brought you to Albemarle and close to us. And even though we didn't expect to have you be the stated supply or the quote unquote fill in guy for 12 years, it's been a huge blessing. So we're very thankful for that. And I know you want to get into some of the why and how you got into the ministry. But could you talk for a few minutes about kind of where you grew up? And something that I've been curious about is we've talked briefly about your denominational background growing up, but could you explain a little bit more about the denomination you grew up in as well as you kind of go through the early stages of your life?
Sure. And I even want to go back a little bit further than that because, unlike many pastors, although there are others like me, but I many times hear pastor, well, I grew up in a Christian home, and uh, it led to one thing or another. I grew up in a Christian home. There's no question about it. But my parents came from a very strange background. My my mother uh, grew up in a family of six children, and she was the oldest. And her father required her to leave school after the eighth grade to take care of her siblings because her mother was kind of sickly. But the interesting thing was my mother was formative influence and was the more intellectually curious of my parents. She liked to read. She liked to try different things. She experimented with cooking, not always with great results, but we had at least a variety of things. Um, but she came from I would say, a nominally Christian background. Her parents were sort of in and out of churches. She was in the Seventh Day Adventist Church for a while. She was confirmed in the Lutheran Church, and then there was my father, who happened to live directly across the street from my mother. My mother actually dated my father's brother first, and then somehow uh, ended up with my father. My father came from a Christian Science background. I don't think he was into it very much himself, but his parents were members of the Christian Science Church, a cult. And so we would say, in a sense, my father, in fact, my father was not a believer. Let's establish that. He was not a believer when he and my mother started dating and ended up getting married. But they were married by the Baptist preacher in in my town. And so when they started taking me to church, it was to this little conservative Baptist church. Uh, and my father was converted in my early childhood, probably when I was 4 or 5 years old, about the same time that I made my own profession of faith. And they they were committed Christians, and my father in particular. When he became a believer, he became a wholehearted believer. When he died, we set up my sister set up a little table at the funeral service, and it the table immediately resonated with all five of us children, siblings, in that it had on the table a cup of coffee, an open Bible, and that was it. They, I, when I remember my father, the only time I ever saw him reading, he would read the newspaper, he would read his Sunday school lesson, and he read his Bible every day. And I know that along with that, he prayed. Uh, he was not an easygoing public Christian, but he grew up in a church where people, were challenged to serve Christ in the church and in their outside lives, and And so my father, for instance, was the deacon in the church, but he was also asked one time to be the Sunday school superintendent. And the Sunday school superintendent in our church was responsible for what we called the opening exercises before the classes actually met. And in the opening exercises, we would sing. It was like a 15-minute little program, and we would sing a hymn or something like that. And then the superintendent would speak. He'd give a little talk, a little devotional, or what have you. My father was probably the worst public speaker I ever heard, but he did it anyway. He labored through those little homilies week after week for the whole year that he was Sunday school superintendent. And I know in some strange way, the Lord used that to lead me eventually, after many years, into the pastorate. The fact that my father, with his limited ability, could still serve in that particular way, along with many of the other examples that he set before me. He was just a basically very godly man, a simple man. He was not theologically sophisticated, nor were most of the people in our church. Our church was a Arminian, evangelical, fundamentalist, Baptist church. We put a lot of emphasis on things that we were not supposed to do. We didn't smoke, we didn't drink, we didn't go to movies, we didn't dance, we didn't play cards, all the kinds of fundamentalist type things. I grew up with all of that, thinking that was perfectly normative. I thought that's what a real serious Christian looked like. I never questioned it. But that sort of began the trajectory of my life, and that we were in that church really the whole time that I was in school growing up. The first pastor I remember was a man named Henry Sorensen, and his wife was my Sunday school teacher in my earliest years. I profoundly respected them. They were there until I was probably 9 or 10 or 11 years old. I don't remember exactly that, but they certainly had a formative influence on my life. And one of the things that I was introduced to very early, and I would say we were church-going Christians. We went Sunday school to morning worship, evening worship, youth group before evening worship, then evening worship, a youth choir when I was growing up. And then eventually in the adult choir as I got older. Wednesday night prayer meeting, we were there. And if we had to walk because of the snow, we didn't live that far away, we could do it. But we were serious about that. But one of the things that was featured, in which I thought it was perfectly normal, hadn't experienced anything else. In fact, I thought the churches that didn't practice this must have something wrong with them. I often said the only Presbyterian that I thought was a Christian was a lady who belonged to the Presbyterian church, but she came to our evening service. But one of the things that was done at our services was the invitation. And people from Arminian fundamentalist backgrounds would often be familiar with this. At the end of the service, after the sermon, the sort of the high point was the service was kind of building up to what was called the invitation, or what some people call the altar call. And you could have a 1, 2, or 3-part invitation, depending on how the pastor felt, I guess. And we kind of dreaded the 3-part because it really prolonged the service. The first part was, of course, the obvious one, and that was when you would invite people, sort of like in a Billy Graham crusade or something, you would invite people to come forward to be saved, to make a profession of faith. And so they would play a hymn and give people time to come forward. And sometimes someone would go forward. Sometimes in a little fundamentalist church like that, there wouldn't be anybody, I guess, needed to be saved. So they you wouldn't get anything. Then you had to, after that, you might have the second part, and that was to rededicate your life to Christ. And so you had to make that kind of appeal. And of course, that was a little harder to resist. I guess theoretically, it should have been you should have been backsliding or falling away from the faith or something. But I was often presented in terms of, well, if you weren't really serious about your commitment last week, you could be more serious this week. And so you would get a few more, perhaps, that would go forward for that. I made that trip a number of times over the years. But then it came the dreaded third invitation, and that was the invitation to commit yourself to full-time Christian service, which of course was meant some sort of profession that we thought of in those terms, like being a missionary or maybe a professor in a Christian college or a pastor was the sort of the big one. And you felt guilty if you didn't really respond to that. And so I made that trip a few times too over the years. And and so that was kind of the beginning of, you might say, my movement toward the pastorate, all of those things together, I suppose. But then there were some other things that both positively and negatively affected my response to that. So let me just pause there and see if that makes sense, or if you have some other questions.
That makes a lot of sense. I'm sitting over here chuckling a little bit. This is enjoyable. I think one question I would ask before you continue would be, did you enjoy the fact that your family was one that went to everything that the church did?
I don't know if I'd use the word enjoy, but I never questioned that it was normative. I think I've heard of other young people who rebelled against that, and I'm aware of young people who have rebelled against that. In fact, even adults who have rebelled against that. But I don't recall ever questioning, and I think from my earliest years, I thought that's what a real Christian did. And in fact, I think perhaps even early on, I developed some bias against people who weren't that committed. I suspect I looked down on people who didn't come back for Sunday night service or that type of thing, although I don't think I really dwelt on it all that much. But for myself and my family, uh, you know, it was an era when young people, I think in general, had more respect for their parents and for the example that they set. And so I can remember one incident in particular. I think later on I did try, when I got into high school, did try to find an excuse for not going to prayer meeting on occasion, saying, well, I had a lot of homework to do or something like that. But I remember one particular Wednesday night, we lived probably 3 blocks from the church at that time. And my dad worked in St. Paul, which was about 12 miles from Stillwater, the town I grew up in. In those days, 12 miles was a journey. And he rode the bus because usually our one or our both of our cars were broken down. We were not well off, let's put it that way. And so he would ride the bus to St. Paul and get home. And it didn't make any difference. On Wednesday night, he still went to prayer meeting. And even though he did not get after us about making excuses for not going sometimes, I remember this particular occasion because it had snowed very heavily during the day, and he could not use the car. We lived on a very steep hill, and so you just couldn't get the car out of the driveway. So here he came, uh, in his suit, he would put a suit on and his overcoat and his big overshoes on, rubber overshoes on, and up without saying anything to us. My brother and I happened to be not in the house studying our homework. We were actually sledding down the hill. And so here he came, dressed up, and off he went to prayer meeting. Even though I didn't go, and I, like a kid, sometimes found an excuse or played to sick on a particular Sunday because I didn't want to go to church. That's another story. Uh, Television was a fairly new thing when I was young, growing up in the late 40s and early 50s. And we didn't get a television until I think it was 1956, because I remember we watched the Republican and Democrat national conventions that year. Um, and of course, having a television, I'd only seen them at the homes of other people. And we really thought that was pretty exciting. And so once in a while, I would pretend to be sick so I could stay home on Sunday morning and watch television. Why? I don't know, because there was nothing but church programs on television and news programs. But those kinds of things happen. I remember seeing my father that Wednesday night trudging through the snow, and I just that marked me, and to this day, um, if I skip church, which of course is a little difficult to do when you're a pastor, but if I skip church when we're traveling or something like that, I feel guilty, and I think my dad's influence definitely is still with me in that respect.
That I definitely resonate with that, and probably an encouragement to young men or fathers now would be that your your actions definitely go a far distance for your children. So thank you for sharing that. So how about you transition to when you're moving out of the house now, heading off to college, and what was your intention for a career path, and then meeting a special someone and so forth.
You're getting ahead of the story a little bit there, Jonathan, but uh, we might have to save that for another one. They, I'll back up a little bit. I talked about that invitation system and feeling guilty if I didn't go forward to in that third part of the invitation for full-time Christian service. In addition to that, however, there was a lot of pressure on that because people really value, at least in our church, really value those callings, and that was we needed missionaries, we needed pastors, and so forth. So if you had any ability or any inclination in that direction, then people in the church, my Sunday school teacher, the youth director who was a teacher in our high school, or the pastor or whoever, would tend to reinforce that in various ways, and just even the general membership. For instance, I remember distinctly, I was 12 years old when this happened. We had a visiting evangelist. We'd always have these evangelistic meetings every year where we'd have a visiting evangelist come in for a week. And this man, I don't remember his name or anything else about him, but as I was leaving the service, we were shaking hands at the back door, and he was standing there. And as I got to him, he took my hand and he looked me straight in the eye and he said, "Young man, God is calling you to the ministry." Just like that. So I had those kinds of things happen to me fairly regularly. If we had a situation where when the youth group was doing something, we used to go out and visit in what we called the old people's homes, or what they would call an assisted care facility today. We had a few of those in town. They were usually big old houses that had been converted into residences for elderly people. and we would go. Our youth group would go there, and we put on a little service for them, a little simple worship service. We'd sing and invite them to sing with us, and then we'd give a little devotional kind of thing. Well, invariably, particularly when I was in high school, when I became one of the older of the young people, I was asked to do this. So I often had those kinds of experiences growing up. But something else was going on during that time as well. As I mentioned to you earlier, Reverend Henry Sorensen was our pastor when I was very young. In my late elementary school years, we got a new pastor, Reverend Paul Kaufman, who also had a profound influence on my life. He was a very scholarly, serious, fundamentalist Baptist Christian. He was a Greek scholar. In fact, he taught Greek at the college level. He often preached out of his Greek New Testament, that kind of ability. And he was there all the way until I went off to college and later got married. So he was perhaps the most influential on my life. But I noticed one thing about both of those pastors that I didn't really understand fully. I didn't reflect on it a whole lot, but I noticed it, and it troubled me in ways that I now more fully appreciate. And that was there seemed to be a kind of arm's length distance between them and the people in the congregation. If you think about a congregation, we often use terms like a family. And so we call it, the Christian family or our church family. And for me, of course, a family was something that you belonged to and you felt safe and accepted in that family. You felt like you were really part of that. It provided a kind of security for you. And I thought about our church family being that way. I had I had a wonderful Sunday school teacher when I was growing up. A single man. I think he married late in life. He wanted to be married earlier, but the girl wouldn't have him, kind of thing. And so he was a single man. But he was like a big brother to us. We had those kinds of relationships with people in the church. But the pastor didn't seem to fit that. And later on, when I thought about it, I thought, well, he can't really be too close to people in the church because he can't, devote himself to one person or another, because everybody wants to have a piece of the pastor. They want equal treatment from the pastor. So I could understand from that standpoint that he had to be careful in his relationships with the people. But for whatever reason, and at that time I really didn't, I think, fully appreciate why some pastors would have that would be an issue with them. Whatever that was, that I think, and I realize now, was something that caused me to not want to go into the ministry, into the pastorate, because I wanted to be part of the family. I didn't want to have a arm's length distance. I didn't want there to be a kind of barrier between me. Like I said, I didn't really think about it that much when I was youthful. All I knew is that during my high school years, I began to resist that idea of going into the ministry, going into the pastorate. And I finally, before I graduated from high school, I thought, well, I've made up my mind. That's out of the. I'm not going to be a missionary. I'm not going to be a minister. I'm going to be a high school history teacher. I loved history, still do, and I loved love maybe is too strong. I really liked and enjoyed my history teachers in junior high and high school. I thought, that's what I want to do. And so, um, in a sense, as I look back on it, I was on a kind of trajectory where I had two competing influences in my life, one moving me toward the pastorate, and the other making me resistant to that idea. And I continued along that track, um, really almost down to the day when I was, well, let's see, 37 years old, and finally said, all right, I'm going to enter the pastorate, and did so in the next year. Does that make sense?
Yes, it absolutely makes sense. So, just to clarify, one of the main reasons that you resisted going into the pastorate was because you felt there would have to be a distance between you and your fellow believers.
Yeah, I didn't know if have to. I mean, yes, I could, like I said, I could understand the idea that a pastor had to maintain some kind of, had to be careful about getting too close to members of the church, lest he be perceived as being, uh, uh, you know, preferring certain members over other members. I could, even at an early age, I could understand why that would be the case. But I also felt that whether it was because of that or because of other things, there was something else there, a kind of barrier almost, which I was fearful of. And I'm saying that now from my perspective today. That's one of the things that I've come to grips with just recently, and I think I understand it better now than I did then. And that's not because I've had that problem myself as a pastor. I'll talk about that more later. Uh, but that at that stage, I didn't really see what the alternative might be. I guess that's a better way to put it. That it was almost like that inevitably had to take place, and I just didn't want to be in that kind of a situation. And I felt that way. I didn't understand then why I felt that way, or at least not the way I do today. I can understand it better today because of other things that have happened to me since.
That makes sense. So, and we'll get more into that later because I'm kind of curious about how you've combated that or figured out that balance in the pastorate. So we'll pick back up on that in a minute. But so you obviously, as you just hinted at, were 37 when you entered the pastorate. What did you do before that?
This is where the journey begins to wander all over the place. Um, when I graduated from high school, as I said, I was determined to go to become a high school history teacher. That was my plan anyway. I chose to go to Wheaton College in Wheaton, Illinois, because that was really the only college I knew anything about. My pastor, Pastor Kaufman, had gone there, and I had a lot of respect for his scholarship and ability and so forth. So I thought, well, that would be a good place to go. I wanted to go to a Christian college because I thought that's what Christians ought to do, and also because no one in my family before me had ever gone to college. I didn't have anybody that really told me things about how you chose a college and why, and what kinds of things you need to be concerned about. That would really come to play in the next step in the journey. But anyway, the only college I even applied to was Wheaton College. I didn't know that Wheaton College was a selective institution, that you didn't necessarily get in because you applied, even if you had been a fairly good student. Uh, but that was all. I applied at Wheaton College. I assumed they would take me, and I would go to Wheaton College. Well, it worked out that way. I actually got to go to Wheaton College. They accepted me. I went to Wheaton College, and my parents, of course, couldn't really afford to send me there, but I got a scholarship and I got a student loan. And I needed to work. I worked part time in various jobs while I was at college to try to help with the bills a little bit. But I ran into problems with my career plan as soon as I got to Wheaton. And that is, they had a lottery system for registration. I think there were 500 in my freshman class, and you had to draw a number for registration, so they could have some order, I guess, in the registration. I think my number was 498 or something like that. So I got none of the classes that I wanted to register for. And I won't go into all of it, the complexity of it, but it sort of temporarily blew my plan up to become a history teacher. And I had to take some things that I didn't really want to take. But for instance, I decided to take some required classes, like Introduction to Philosophy. That was required as a student there. So I thought, well, I'll get that out of the way. Not because I wanted to take philosophy, because you had to. And I also, Wheaton at that time required all the male students to participate in ROTC, Army ROTC, for the first 2 years. And I absolutely loved that. There was something about being in that military type of setting I really did enjoy. In fact, began thinking about making a career as an Army officer, since I was already having trouble becoming a history teacher. The other thing that happened to me in my freshman year is I had a really interesting roommate. Bill Jordan was his name. Oh, I should tell you that Wheaton didn't have enough dorm space for all of the students, and so we ended up living in the home of one of the professors. There were 5 of us who lived in the upstairs of this professor's home. Bill Jordan was my roommate, and Bill was the son of a Reformed Episcopal bishop from South Carolina. I had the term Reformed when I was growing up. The only experience I had with it was Reformed school. That's what they called the prison that they sent bad juveniles to. And so the term meant nothing to me theologically or ecclesiastically. But I knew he wasn't a Baptist, that's for sure. And the second thing was Episcopal. My understanding of the Episcopals church was that was a Catholic church without the Pope. That's about as much as I knew. We had an Episcopal church in our town. I knew nothing about it. But Bill Jordan was one of the godliest people I've known in my whole life. I thought of myself as being pretty godly, but he made me look ridiculous. This guy would get up at 5 a.m. and go to prayer meeting every day. And not me. I've never been a morning person. So it was one of those, really, all those things together just sort of messed up my plan. Well, during that year, I also met some people who were like me in another way, and I haven't mentioned this before. I really began to develop a kind of right-wing political consciousness growing up. I had a teacher who was very conservative, one of my history teachers, very conservative politically, and he used to feed me books to read along those lines. I became quite radicalized, and while I was at Wheaton, I met a man who, and this is another one of those crazy things that happens. One of the books that this history teacher gave me was a book called I Was a Slave in Russia by a man named John Noble. And John Noble and it was his family actually, owned a camera factory in Germany, and they were interned in Germany during World War II. They were Americans, but because they got caught up in the war, they had to stay there. And at the end of the war, they were in the eastern section of Germany, which of course was taken over by the Russians. And John and his father got shipped off to Soviet concentration camps, and only got out because in the 1950s they were able to sneak out word to somebody who was being released, and President Eisenhower, as I understand it, intervened with Khrushchev to get him released. Khrushchev, the leader of the Soviet Union. And John Noble wrote a book about his experiences there, and that book had quite an influence on me. Well, while I was at Wheaton, I was walking downtown one day, and I walked past, and there was a bookstore on the street, and in the window of that bookstore was the book, I Was a Slave in Russia, featured in that window. So I walked in the bookstore, and there was an old man sitting in a chair in the bookstore, rather poorly dressed. And there was another older man behind the counter. And so when I went in, the man behind the counter welcomed me, but didn't say much more. But the man sitting in the chair said something to me, and I said, "Well, I saw this book in the window, which I read when I was in school, and I was just curious about it." And the old man said, "Well, that man behind the counter is John Noble's father." Well, make a long story short, that led to my getting involved in some conservative groups and activities. And at the end of my freshman year at Wheaton, some of the people in this group came to me. A couple of the people in the group said, "We've heard about this organization called International Christian Youth, which is having a conference out in New Jersey in early June, and that's apparently very conservative Christian group, and a couple of us are going to go, and would you be interested in going?" And I said, "Well, sure, anything like that sounded good to me." My plan was to go back to Wheaton in the fall and continue my education there. But so I thought, well, I'd go to this conference, go home for the summer, and then go back to Wheaton. And so we went. We drove out to New Jersey, to Cape May, New Jersey, on the southern tip of New Jersey, and went to this conference, which was held at a place called the Christian Admiral Hotel. It was a big old hotel, and it had been turned into a Christian conference center. Well, when I was there, I met some students from a college called Shelton College, Shelton, which was at that time located in northern New Jersey. I had never heard of it before, knew nothing about it whatsoever. But I was so impressed by these students, their Christian commitment and their conservative credentials. That was the other thing. I didn't see a whole lot of that at Wheaton with the Wheaton students, although I'm sure they would have been typically conservative. But these were really politically, what do I want to say, committed, anti-communist, conservative Christians, and that's what I was. I felt very much at home with them. If you were going back to this family theme of belonging and so forth, I felt that these were people that I really could belong to or with. And so I just, on the spur of the moment, decided I would transfer to Shelton College. My pastor, Pastor Kaufman, I found out later, was so angry about my decision that he actually wrote a kind of negative pastoral reference letter, because you had to have one to get into Shelton College. He tried to, I think, subtly undermine my being accepted at the college. what he didn't realize was that Shelton College was so desperate for students that if you were breathing, they would take you. So, and I had no idea what Shelton College was not an accredited institution like Wheaton. It didn't have none of those things meant anything to me because I didn't know anything about colleges. Like I said, I grew up in a family nobody had ever gone to college. I didn't know those things were important, so those were not even considerations. I'm going to Shelton College, and that's what I did. In the fall of that year, I ended up at this little college in the mountains of North New Jersey. And shortly after I got there, and it was a small college, there were about 300 students, so you quickly got to know people. And they had a lot of activities. We had small group kinds of activities, and quickly began to develop relationships. I was in a small dormitory. It was actually a converted chicken barn that had, I think there were 8 of us we each had a private room, which was one of the nice things. We each had our own private little. The room now was the size of probably a typical bathroom today, but anyway, it was our little room, and I quickly developed friendships there with fellow students. And one of the fellows in our dorm was from North Carolina. His name was Davy Critcher. I hope if he ever hears this, he doesn't get mad at me. But Davy was a little guy, and I mean he loved Jesus. He was so excited about being a Christian. He was just fun to be around. He was just always excited about being a Christian, and he had been a preacher since he was 12 years old. So he was there to get some training. But now we start out in September. This is October. In October, they had a student event called Sadie Hawkins Day. Sadie Hawkins was a character in the old Little Abner comic strip in the newspapers of those days. And Sadie Hawkins was always trying to get a man. She was always chasing guys, trying to get a man, catch a man. And so they had this event. Now here's this very strict fundamentalist kind of school. They're very circumspect about your behavior. You had to sign a pledge, just like at Wheaton: no drinking, no smoking, no going to movies, no dancing, those kinds of things. They had all that there. The women all had a curfew. They had to be in their dorms by 10 o'clock, and the guys didn't necessarily have a curfew, but that broke that sort of up. Anyway, they had Sadie Hawkins Day, and on Sadie Hawkins Day, girls would chase the guys and catch one, kind of thing is the way it was. Some of these were arranged. In my case, there was an arranged catch. Had a very shy young lady, very nice young lady, but she was just too shy to chase me. So her friends arranged for me to be in a certain place at a certain time so she could pounce on me. And what we did is we went to a banquet that night in the dining hall, our very simple banquet. And the ladies would make a corsage. You tried to dress up like what you thought country mountain type people say, little Abner type people dressed like. And she made me a corsage of vegetables glued to a paper plate. And after the banquet, that was basically it. That was the end of the celebration for that particular date for me. But Davy Critcher got captured by this girl that I had seen before and had watched, and I thought she was one of the most gorgeous creatures I'd ever seen. But I also thought she was sort of a sophisticated big city girl who would not have any intentions of being around me. So I didn't approach her, I just stayed away from her. David Critcher got captured by this girl. He was so excited he almost couldn't breathe. And he said, he was talking about this, and I'm thinking in the back of my mind, I said, "Yeah, I know why she did it. You're from the mountains of North Carolina. She's just going to go on a date with you and just make you feel like an idiot." Um, well, he came back from that date that night, and he was walking on a cloud. He was so he was so happy and so excited, and oh, it was so wonderful. And they had gone bowling, and she was just talking about this stuff, and I thought, maybe I misjudged this girl, but I still, would have never ever thought about approaching her. And so, not long after that, maybe just a week or so after that, I should have said I was working on the student newspaper, and as a result of working on the newspaper, I was late going to dinner one night, walking down the hallway, and the we had a big old manor house kind of main building there on the campus, and the newspaper office was in there, and the dining hall was at the end of that building on the lower level of the chapel. And so I'm walking from the newspaper office on the lower level, sort of the basement level of this building, going to the dining hall, and here comes this girl down the stairway from the next level. She got to the bottom of the stairway, and she stopped there and waited for me to get there. And of course, I just planned to walk on by. But when I got there, she said, "May I sit with you?" And as I've told the story to people before, it was the only time in my life where I felt like my heart actually stopped. I could not believe it, that this girl. But anyway, she did, and that's where things began to take a dramatic shift. And I think, Jonathan, that might be a story that, from that point, would be worth taking up as its own segment.
I agree, man. That's so cool to hear. I've heard bits and pieces of that story, but um, man, that's just so fun to hear, to see that over a long time now too,
Yeah,
which look forward to hearing more about. But I think you're right. I think that's a good stopping point for today. So we've gotten through most of the first half of your life, and I think that'll segue pretty straightforward into your ministry, the next section of your life, and we can talk more about the details of how you got into the Reformed faith and so forth. A little sneak peek at our next talk. But
yeah.
thank you, Grandpa, for sharing. And sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, you said generously the first half of my life. We're actually only at the first 25% of my life, not even that quite, because at this point I was only 20 years old.
Well,
We're still
that's
early in the story.
well, that's fair. And it seems a little bit strange for me to say that because now you're just up to my entire life. But no,
Yes.
that's awesome. Well, thanks for talking, Grandpa, and I look forward to our next one. And thank you for listening if you've listened this far, and I look forward to having you next time.
Thank you. I've enjoyed it.